Smoke stung the eyes. The wind tore across the Texas plains, carrying the smell of scorched earth and hay. Metal groaned under pressure. A fence post snapped, sending a sharp crack through the air. Somewhere behind, the cattle panicked, hooves hammering the dirt, eyes wide with terror. A man crouched low, hands trembling around a thin wire. His uniform, a faded gray, marked him as enemy, a prisoner of war. The farmers had laughed when he offered his stupid trick earlier. Now, the laughter had vanished, replaced by shouts and curses. Sweat ran down his temples, mixing with dust and blood from a cut on his cheek. The machinery rattled. Sparks flew. If the wire failed, the fence would collapse entirely. The cattle stampeding straight into the barn, into the workers, into disaster. He took a deep breath, heart hammering, every second stretching, cracking like dry wood. Above him, the sky churned, a low rumble warning of thunder, or perhaps the moment when everything would go wrong. One hand steadied the wire. One eye watched the beasts. One question burned in his mind. Could this foolish idea really work? Because what happened next would rewrite everything. The farm stretched wide under the relentless Texas sun, fields of wheat and corn swaying in uneasy rhythm with the wind. In ordinary times, it was a place of routine. Early mornings bending over soil, the metallic scent of tools, the low moan of livestock in pens. But 1943 was no ordinary time. World War II had stretched across continents, and the war had arrived here in the most unexpected form. German prisoners of war working the American farmland. The United States faced a manpower shortage. Many young men were overseas, and farms were left vulnerable, their survival tied to both crops and the fleeting hands of those behind barbed wire fences. The POWs were not volunteers. They were soldiers, captured in battles far away, thrust into a life of routine labor under armed supervision. Their days began before dawn and ended after dusk. Hands calloused, muscles straining, a constant awareness of authority breathing down their necks. Yet, in this forced service, they became indispensable. Machinery broke, fences failed, animals wandered, and the men, trained in precision, discipline, and improvisation, found themselves relied upon. The farmers, initially distrustful, had begun to recognize the utility in the very presence they had feared. Suspicion coexisted uneasily with dependence. Every interaction was layered with tension. A POW offering advice, a farmer considering it, and both wondering how far trust could extend in a world fractured by war. Machines clattered in the barn, chains and belts singing under the strain of moving harvests. Cattle stampeded in enclosed pastures, and fields awaited meticulous attention before the next drought or storm struck. Political pressures weighed heavily beyond the farm's fence lines. The United States was feeding both soldiers abroad and civilians at home. One failed crop could ripple into rationing, shortages, and public alarm. Every day, every decision on this farm became part of a vast, interconnected war effort, a microcosm of global stakes pressed into the hands of men with wire, rope, and calloused palms. The Texas summer was merciless. Sun baking the earth into cracked, hard patterns, sweat clinging to every surface, blurring the line between man and dust. The POW camp sat at the edge of the property, a cluster of wooden barracks behind barbed wire, guarded but not heavily fortified. The prisoners moved under watchful eyes, performing tasks that ranged from plowing fields to repairing fences. And yet the environment was charged with an undercurrent of tension. Civilians and soldiers existed side by side, worlds colliding. The farmers wary of enemy hands, the POWs navigating rules that alternated between strict and absurd. Life in the camp was regimented, yet unevenly enforced. Some prisoners found small freedoms in routine labor, moments to prove competence or ingenuity, but every act carried risk. A broken tool, a misread instruction, or a miscalculated move could bring punishment. Farm owners oscillated between distrust and necessity. A single German soldier might be tasked with wiring a gate, patching a barn door, or securing a pen for livestock, mundane actions that now held consequences far beyond their scale. The thin line between a simple task and catastrophe was constantly tested, sharpened by wartime pressures. The Texas landscape itself was unforgiving. Heavy rains could flood fields overnight, while sudden winds tore at fences and barns. Livestock panicked easily, machinery failed without warning, and isolation meant help was hours away. Against this backdrop, a single act, a wire trick, a patch, a clever adjustment, could avert disaster. The stakes were immediate. A barn intact or leveled, animals safe or stampeding, labor uninterrupted or lost to chaos. Each day, every man, whether farmer or POW, confronted both the ordinary and extraordinary, the mundane and the perilous, all under the shadow of a war that stretched from the Pacific to Europe, but had, improbably, found its way into this small corner of Texas. The prisoner crouched low, eyes tracing the taut line of wire he had set hours earlier. To the farmers, it had seemed pointless, a stupid trick dreamed up by a man in gray overalls. But for him, it was a calculated risk, grounded in understanding the machinery, the animals, and the unpredictable Texas wind. Every movement carried weight. One slip could undo hours of labor, release a herd, and spark chaos. He was acutely aware of the judgment around him, of the skeptical eyes that measured competence and threat in equal measure. Fear mingled with focus, the human tension sharpened by responsibility he did not choose but could not escape. From the farmer's perspective, every POW action was a gamble. Trust was earned in the smallest increments. A repaired fence post, a halting cow guided back into the pen, a machine coaxed back to life. The war had thrust these men into roles that demanded ingenuity under duress. Some farmers monitored silently, fists clenched, waiting for failure to validate suspicion. Others found themselves grudgingly reliant on the precise hands of the men they had once considered enemies. The psychological tension was subtle but constant, a quiet pressure amplified by sweat, dust, and the relentless Texan sun. Technological constraints amplified the stakes. The barns were old, machinery antiquated, and materials limited. Wire, rope, and simple pulleys were often all that stood between disaster and catastrophe. The POW's mind worked in practical geometry, in forces and leverage, in anticipating animal panic and mechanical failure simultaneously. Each adjustment was a measured risk, a small intervention with disproportionate consequences. Every click, snap, and groan of equipment echoed through the tense air, a constant reminder that one misstep could unravel hours of labor and the fragile calm of the farm. The enemy perspective, though unspoken, shaped every interaction on the farm. These men were soldiers trained to follow orders, to assess risk, to calculate outcomes in battle. Stripped of weapons, confined behind barbed wire, their skills translated into tasks that seemed mundane, yet demanded the same discipline. Every fence mended, every gate reinforced, carried echoes of their past lives, an understanding of tension, force, and consequence honed in war, but now applied to cattle and crops. The irony was not lost on them. Survival depended not on combat, but on precision and ingenuity in the civilian world. Leadership decisions on both sides rippled invisibly through the fields. Farm owners dictated work, balancing risk to property with reliance on the POW's skills. Camp officers enforced rules, sometimes intervening, often observing, aware that morale and discipline could shift with a single miscalculation. Each directive weighed human life, livestock, and property alongside the broader demands of a nation at war. The men themselves became microcosms of command and obedience, where a small technical decision could carry consequences far beyond what anyone predicted. Moral dilemmas permeated the work. Civilians wrestled with distrust, the instinct to control, and the necessity of collaboration. POWs negotiated compliance with authority, protecting themselves while attempting to prove competence. Every action carried judgment. Success could bring respect or grudging acceptance. Failure could provoke anger, suspicion, or punishment. In this delicate balance, the stupid trick of the wire became more than a technical maneuver. It was a moment where human ingenuity collided with human doubt, and where the smallest act could carry extraordinary weight. The wire snapped tight under his hands. Sparks hissed where it scraped against metal, slicing through the thick, humid air. The cattle's hooves thundered closer, dust rising in choking clouds, hooves striking the barn door with a hollow, urgent clang. The POW's fingers bled from pressure, every nerve screaming as he twisted the wire, adjusted tension, measured the weight and motion of panic he could barely control. One miscalculation and the fence would fail, sending animals smashing through the barn, machinery collapsing, men and women caught in the chaos. Above, the sky had darkened to a steel gray, wind tearing at rooftops, scattering straw and debris. The farmhands yelled, voices cracking with panic, running to intervene, but frozen by fear of both the animals and the machinery. The POW ignored them, mind singularly fixed on force, angle, leverage. He had rehearsed this maneuver countless times in his head, but imagination and reality diverged sharply here. The wire vibrated, sang under tension, threatening to snap with every heartbeat. Time seemed to stretch. The barn quivered. Cattle slammed against fences and gates, pressing, panicked, wild with adrenaline. The wire, thin and unassuming, was the only thing standing between disaster and survival. Sweat streamed into his eyes, burning, stinging. But he could not blink. He could only calculate, pull, twist, and hope that the geometry of his stupid trick held true under impossible pressure. A sudden groan echoed through the barn as the main gate shifted under the weight of the panicked herd. The wire, taut and trembling, held. Each strand seemed impossibly fragile against the force pressing against it, yet it flexed, absorbed, and endured. The POW's hands burned, knuckles white, muscles screaming, but he held firm, adjusting minutely with every shove of an animal, every creak of wood. The farmers watched, frozen between disbelief and awe. Their earlier scorn replaced with raw, urgent hope. One cow lunged forward, horns glinting, hooves skidding on the dusty floor. The wire bent, threatening to snap. Instinct took over. He shifted weight, twisted a corner post, tightened a loop. The machinery groaned in protest, chains rattling, metal shrieking, and then, miraculously, held. The animals slowed, confusion replacing panic. Dust hung heavy, the air thick with sweat, hay, and the metallic tang of fear. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Then the tension eased in imperceptible fractions. The barn stood. The herd remained contained. No machinery collapsed. No lives lost. The POW lowered himself, trembling, hands slick with blood and sweat, heart pounding, breathing ragged. Around him, disbelief rippled, then a cautious, hesitant relief. The stupid trick had worked. A simple act of ingenuity, born of skill and courage under pressure, had averted catastrophe. The dust settled slowly, drifting in lazy curls through the sweltering Texas air. The barn stood intact, the herd finally quiet, ears flicking, hooves stamping softly on the packed dirt. Farmhands wiped sweat from their brows, eyes wide, minds racing over what could have happened. Machinery, battered but unbroken, hummed in relief, a low metallic exhale after the tension. The POWs sat on a fallen beam, hands shaking, staring at the wire that had held against impossible force. A thin line between disaster and salvation. Relief mingled with astonishment. Farmers approached cautiously, hesitant to break the fragile equilibrium, yet compelled to see the man who had saved them. Their earlier scorn had dissolved into a complex blend of respect, gratitude, and lingering suspicion. Each realized, silently, that the war's reach had extended here in ways they had never imagined. A German soldier, an enemy in uniform, had become the arbiter of their safety, and the farm's survival now rested on the ingenuity of someone they had barely trusted. The POW's own perspective remained measured, eyes scanning, muscles still taut from exertion. He understood the fragility of what had been achieved. One wrong move, one snapped wire, and the result could have been ruin. Yet in that fragile, tense victory, there was recognition. Not from authority, not from accolades, but from the simple, undeniable fact that skill, careful observation, and quick thinking had prevailed. The emotional weight was heavy, yet muted. The relief quiet, almost reverent, like a secret shared between men who had survived something larger than themselves. Word of the near disaster spread quickly through the farm and surrounding community. Farmers who had once doubted the POW's competence now spoke of him in hushed tones, a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The machinery, though scratched and groaning from the stress, continued to function, and the herd, once wild with panic, grazed calmly, unaware of the catastrophe narrowly avoided. The physical damage had been minimal, but the psychological impact was profound. Trust had been earned in a single, precise act. Military supervisors noted the outcome as well. The POW's actions demonstrated the practical utility of skill and training, even in unconventional circumstances. Reports filed in camp logs highlighted the event, not as an anecdote, but as a validated instance of problem-solving under pressure. The story, mundane to some, became evidence of the thin margin separating order from chaos, life from injury, and success from failure. For the humans involved, the aftermath lingered longer than the visible results. Farmers returned to work with a renewed, cautious respect for the men behind the wire. The POW himself carried the memory as quietly as he had executed the act. A testament to precision, patience, and the necessity of action under duress. In the broader scope of war, it was a minor episode. Yet for those on the farm, it had been monumental. A moment when a single wire, a measured hand, and a cool mind had held back disaster, preserved life, and sustained livelihoods. In the quiet that followed, the farm resumed its rhythm, the sun climbing high over fields that had been seconds from chaos. The POW worked alongside the farmers, hands steady, mind alert. Yet no words were needed to mark the event. The wire had held, not through luck, but through calculation, courage, and the disciplined mind of a man trained for war, yet acting in peace. History often records battles and strategies, generals and nations. But sometimes, it is in these small, overlooked moments. A thin wire, a tense heartbeat, a decision made under pressure, that human ingenuity leaves its mark. Lives preserved, trust rebuilt, disaster averted. In the shadow of global conflict, a single act could ripple across lives, quietly, irreversibly. The lesson endures. Courage is not always loud, heroism not always visible, and even a stupid trick can hold a world of consequence in its fragile line.